Bueno, pues bienvenidas y bienvenidos a nuestro segundo taller de la Asamblea de Mujeres del
Okay, welcome everyone to a second workshop of the Women's Assembly of the European Forum. On 13th November, we had our first workshop about economic violence in the context of COVID. For those of you who could not attend, have a look because it was very interesting. Today, in these 2 hours, we are going to be focusing on the fight against sexist violence in Europe in the context of COVID and also with the rise of conservative forces on the far right. First of all, let us share some technical announcements. We have interpretation today into 3 languages, Spanish, English, and French. We're also broadcasting through Facebook Live, through the forum's account, and you will only see that in 1 language through Facebook. So if you cannot follow the other languages, just join us on Zoom and you can choose the language. You can do that through this globe that you have on the bottom of your screen, and you can choose the language you will be listening to. Before I introduce the great speakers we have for today, we'd like to encourage you to participate. This is a space for us to learn and to exchange ideas and opinions. So we will have divided it into 3 blocks so that you can organize your proposals and your ideas, and you can share them with us through the chat. After each of the blocks, the speakers will have time to reply to your questions. And of course, I want to thank all the colleagues who have helped us create the space through collective work and care, the interpreters, and all the colleagues who are not visible and who are not here today, maybe, but we know these spaces as feminist and international spaces could not exist. So without any further ado, I will be introducing the 3 speakers for today. We have Hanna Luczkiewicz. I hope I pronounced this properly. She is a Polish colleague living in Brussels since 2014. And she's actively working in the feminist movement, and she's also a member of Elles Sans Frontières. For those of you who are not familiar with this association, it was founded in 2015 to raise awareness, feminist awareness amongst Polish women living in Belgium. This is the first association of this kind, and it tries to fight against gender violence and the discrimination of Polish women in Belgium. Right now, they are organizing the Brussels Women's Conferences. So they gather 1,000 women and they address topics such as sexuality, feminist economy, sexual violence and work, and of course, other political aspects of feminism. She also works together with the Polish Women's Parliament. This is the Congress. This is the biggest association in Poland. And the conference I was telling you about in Brussels has been announced for the beginning of December about feminist activism. Elles Sans Frontières also organizes different campaigns for women and girls. They have awareness and empowerment workshops for women, also about sexuality, the body, and women's personal development. We also have Clara Alonso. She is the communications director of the Ministry for Equality in Spain. She is a journalist and an equal opportunity agent. She's also a feminist activist when she has time, and she pays attention to redistribution policies and the care crisis. Before she became the communications director of the Ministry for the Equality, she worked in different projects developing communication strategies, especially on social media. She has also been responsible for the internal communications department in Izquierda Unida for years, and she was the leader of the campaigns in 2015 and 2016, and she's also a member of the executive board of the Communist Party in Spain as communications in charge. And last but not least, we have Rosen Hischer. She's a survivor, prostitution survivor, coming from France, and she belongs to the Global Survivors March initiative. She is currently supporting victims of trafficking, violence, and prostitution to help them come out of the situation, in particular by providing administrative and moral support. She's also part of prevention projects and also sexual education with teenagers. And she's been a speaker for courses for clients, people who have been arrested because they were clients of prostitution. So we're about to start. Welcome to the three of you. Thank you for being here. And we will begin with a global overview of our regions and in terms of the feminist struggle. We know that in the current situation, we're not just facing the pandemic, but also the extreme right and the far right and other conservative forces that are targeting the women's movements and the feminist movement in Europe. In Europe, we have two examples that bring together the correlation of these two aspects and how they're fighting against our movement. Hate speech, the invisibilization of women, of gender violence, and the opposition to our rights is faced by a highly combative feminist movement that is happening during the lockdown period and the COVID pandemic. We have two different examples, Poland and the Spanish state. So we would like to start by seeing what kind of differences we see in the feminist struggle and the situation in the lives of women between a country where we have a left-wing government and another one with a right-wing government and also the church as a member of the state.
Sorry for speaking English. I hope you can all understand me well. So I will briefly explain where we are right now, but I think it's important for you to take a step back. So where did it all start? So I think it's quite curious to see how the Polish abortion law, how did it develop? Because already in the 30s, Poland had one of the most liberal law in Europe. It was 1932, so 100 years ago, we established a very liberal, at that time, liberal abortion law that actually is very similar to what we are having right now in Poland. And in 1956, Poland had also a very modern law that created this very bizarre situation that Western European women, especially from Belgium, would come to Poland to conduct abortion. So what happened next? How come that we are now in the situation that we have the most conservative abortion law together with Malta in the European Union? And you can ask yourself this question: where does it come from? And of course, the answer is quite simple. Everything started in 90s when the role of the Catholic Church became very strong, and there's this marriage between the Polish Catholic Church and the Polish right-wing parties, and it's been there for 30 years, and it's something that regardless whether we had Law and Justice like we have right now or before with leftist parties, this marriage between the Catholic Church and the government or governments in general has been extremely strong. So just this as a sort of a background, I think it's important to understand, for you to understand that the history of abortion, the history of female activism has been there for almost 1 century. So where are we right now? As many of you know, on the 22nd of October, we had a ruling of the Constitutional Court stating that limiting the possibility of abortion in Poland. It's been already, as I said, very conservative, but now there are actually only 2 possibilities for women to conduct an abortion. One is related to rape or incest, and the other one is related to mother's health. However, 98% of legal abortions in Poland are related to a potential severe fetal defect. And this is the element that was by the Constitutional Court limited. So as you can see, out of this very, very tiny bit of abortion that was possible, now 98% of that is actually eliminated. So we have, out of 1,000 legal abortions, only 2% will be officially allowed under the current ruling. As you know, Poland is already having very little legal abortions. Legally, we have around 1,200 abortions annually. Just a comparison, in most of Western European countries, it's around 100 times more. So you can imagine that 90% of those abortions are happening illegally. They are happening either underground in Poland, or what is very common is that a lot of Polish women are going either to Czechia or to Germany or Austria, because those are the countries that are helping Polish women. So where are we right now? Since 3 weeks, all over the country, we have been protesting against the ruling by the Constitutional Court, and this is something extremely positive. We've never seen that many women and young people protesting. For example, in Warsaw, we had more than 500,000 people protesting, and as you can see, Poland is also one of the most badly affected countries by Corona. So having 500,000 people protesting in Warsaw, it's extreme. And some people say that Poland actually has never seen that many women and that many people on Polish streets. And it's not only about Warsaw. We have tiny protests in almost every village, in big cities, in small cities. So this is a huge movement that is extremely positive. And I think the Polish government was quite shocked that it would bring that many women on the streets because of the Corona, because of the fact that that people are kind of used to having the current government being quite conservative. But this huge wave of protests, it's something a very, very positive. And together with those protests, you can see that the division that was there before, the division that at least half of the population was against abortion or against liberalizing abortion, is shifting towards the fact that the whole society is feeling that there is a need for change. So just to conclude what we are doing here in Brussels, as my organization is based in Brussels, we've organized 5 huge protests. The last one took place just 2 days ago on our Independence Day. On the 11th of November, we had more than 400 participants. And we actually are quite grateful also towards the Spanish community, because your MEP, Mrs. Garcia Perez, took part in our protest and also gave a very important speech. We are actually supported by a number of MEPs, also from Germany, Spain, Sweden, Finland. So it's actually becoming more and more of a general issue of female and feminist cooperation. Thank you. I think this gives you a glimpse of where we are right now in Poland.
Muchísimas gracias, Hannah. Obviamente también tenemos eso, ¿no? Que pensar.
Thank you so much, Hannah. We also have to think that when we think about today's context, we have to think about the background and what happened before and how we're preparing for the future. We are seeing the situation in Poland is affecting all of us women, and those red lightning bolts are present in our regions. So without any further ado, Clara, if you want to take the floor to discuss the European scenario and how the different forces correlate and see how this works with what Hannah was presenting. Now we're moving to a country where there is a left-wing government. Yes, it is true that we have a government, left-wing government, but we also have the far right seating in parliament with 53 seats. So we have to see the reaction from this perspective, and also that there are, even when the policies come from a feminist perspective, if we compare with other European countries. So the question has to do with what Hannah was saying, where we come from in Spain. As you know, we've had a cycle of feminist movements in the years 2017, 18 and 19. So we have the feminist strike, but this is all connected with other feminist struggles internationally. So this is not something specific from Spain. this is in line with what is happening globally in the feminist movement in the world. And that's why when we go back to our genealogy in Spain, and we were also looking at the Polish colleagues when we started discussing how the strike came about. And when we think about this feminist movement and solidarity around the world, we have to think that this is the most important political movement in recent years. We've been capable of articulating an internationalist struggle. But of course, there's a reaction, a backlash from the far right, and they have at their core the questioning of women's rights, the LGBT movement, or trans people. So there's some tension right now between the feminist movement and the far right. In Spain, as you know, we're making progress in terms of the legislation that has to do with the women's rights, and this is the outcome of a feminist movement. And I will discuss later the Sexual Freedom Act, but also we are moving forward in terms of the rights of trans people. And but there's a lot of tension with the far right, as I was saying. So this has to help us see the dimension of the steps we're taking, because as I said, sometimes this is not an easy road, and it is difficult to continue moving forward. Apart from that, as Hannah was saying, we also have to think that the MEP from GUE wrote an article recently, and I liked it very much, where she said that that feminism is something that you do with your body. So we have been hardly hit by the pandemic, because feminism has a lot to do with touching, with being together, creating networks and creating communities, but it has also affected women a lot, because we have discussed this not just in Spain, but also in other European countries. The pandemic has had a strong impact on the lives of women. For example, female professions, you know that in Spain, 70% of the healthcare workers are women. They're mainly working in nursing and care. And also, most of the people who have been leading essential services are women in shops, and the services that have been working non-stop during the pandemic. The pandemic has also had an impact on women's lives in terms of care, because we've seen something that feminists have been saying for a long time, and which is that there's a crisis, a care crisis. This is obvious, and it has to do with the way capitalism works. And the pandemic has thrown light on this thing, and has brought the importance of care into the limelight, but at the same time, it has overburdened women with care work, looking after the children, people, care-dependent individuals, etc. So the pandemic, as feminism has done with the body, the pandemic has had a strong impact on us and on the importance and the possibilities of the feminist movement in terms of facing the far right. But I was very happy to hear how Hannah is telling us how women are organizing themselves even in this context, and this confirms how the feminist movement is moving forward. We've seen this in Chile, we've seen this in many different countries in Latin America. So for me, the basic question is whether feminism, from my point of view, is still the most important access to fight against the far right. I think that there are things that have to do with women's rights, and not only, but also with the rights of LGBT individuals and trans people and all the communities that are fighting the patriarchy. And this is something that we have to stand for. And I think that this is a message that we're launching from the government of Spain, and that we cannot take a step back in terms of the rights of women. Quite the opposite. We have to take a step forward. We have to continue moving to get our rights and to accomplish our goals, which is getting human rights for all. And this is the spirit that is behind most of the acts that we are developing in the Spanish Ministry of Equality, against gender violence, sexist violence. I think that during the pandemic, we focused on that, and we can share that later, but also in the field of other bills and acts that are being discussed, for example, the distribution of wealth, care work, or the acknowledgement of trans people's rights and LGBT communities, hate crimes. These are all topics that are high on the European agenda, not only with Poland, but also in Hungary. And we have some things being undertaken by the Commission as well, but we will have time for that later, so we can continue now with the discussion.
Thank you very much to both of you for the very interesting remarks. We wanted to start with this global framework because we are aware that in times of pandemic, many decisions have been made in many countries using the pandemic as an excuse to try to minimize our achievements and leave them behind. And it has been also very important to see Clara's example, this fight for common sense. And despite a situation where half of the population didn't favor the sexual and reproductive rights of women, well, in times of pandemic, with these conservative powers in Poland, things are changing now. And we have to recognize this reality because you said, Clara, that we are a new power to fight against hatred speeches. But we have a question by our friend from Greece, and it is for Hannah. She asks, how have been women influenced by this pandemic situation, and they have taken to the streets, as Clara said. Well, the body aspect of it, we can't touch each other, however, this has been overcome.
Thank you very much for your question. Of course, with every revolution, there is a lot of spontaneity and quite a lot of organization. So we have a big organization called All Women Protest Strike. This organization was actually starting everything from the 22nd of October, but a lot of initiatives were quite were just grassroots movements. So we had in every single village one woman or two or three that decided, let's do something together. So it was actually quite nice to see that we had those two levels, a very well organized structure of messages and protests, and we had also individual initiatives. And this is something that is quite new in a sense that for the first time, I think, at least from my understanding, we had such a strong low-level villages taking part in something that they feel it's important. And a good example is that those things were also happening in those cities, on those villages that were predominantly dominated by law and justice. So we had villages that supported in 70% law and justice in the last election, but at the same time we had 200 or 300 women shouting peace off. So peace is the name of the party, the name of law and justice. So you can see that this protest also created a substantial shift towards opposition towards opposition towards this party, which we have never seen before. And we also see that the party currently is now bottom law support. So I think this is something that the government has not predicted, and this very strong grassroots movements of women is something really, really positive.
Vale, muchas gracias. Bueno, y la siguiente pregunta también es para
Thank you, Hannah. And we have a second question for you, so please ask questions to Clara as well. Because as you said, at the end of the day, this is a topic that affects all of us. The other question is how in Poland we have gone from a fight for the rights of abortion and reproductive rights to a situation in which there is something against the government, a very strong, radical government with a big support by the church, it has lost legitimacy. And we have seen even tractors in the sector of agriculture. And we have seen how all those people went to the protest in those tractors. This has been a bit violent, and we have even seen the action of the police. So the question is, how did this happen? How did people realize that this was not only about abortion, how it reached a different dimension? And we would like to have a look at the future and tell us about what will next Wednesday be like in Poland. On your microphone, please, your microphone. Hannah, you need to switch on your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Like low, I don't know.
No?
No,
Can you
yeah,
hear me?
no, great. Thank you.
Perfect. Sorry. So once again, I think this is something that we did not expect. Firstly, we did not expect that so many men would join us. More or less, usually we have around 20 to 30% of men supporting our protests and being very active. And also, we did not expect that it will become such a national movement. As you said, there were tractors, there were farmers, there were a lot of, we got a lot of support from LGBT community. And this is something interesting that in Poland, feminists in general cooperate very strongly with our friends from LGBT communities. We got a lot of support also from anarchists. We got support from also from ecological movements, from the Green Party. So it became some sort of a very national movement of people feeling this strong sense of dissatisfaction, be it because of the abortion law, be it because of the economical situation. So I think there was this energy growing, and it actually brought a lot of people from different groups to the streets.
Bueno, pues nada, muchísimas gracias por las preguntas y nada,
Well,
simplemente
thank you very much for the questions. It's been a pleasure to listen to you talking about this as if it was some type of revolution. That's what we hope. And we hope as well that Wednesday, the 18th, everybody will take to the streets. At least in Spain, we are organizing protests to show support. We hope that this will be echoed in the rest of Europe and that we will recover common sense, the hegemony and the alternative to extreme right. So we can move on to the next item, the sexist violence in times of pandemic. This has been different in the planet, but we can remember the quote of our Argentinian colleagues, feminicide doesn't go into quarantine. And in many countries, we lack figures, so we know that violence has increased, but there is a disparity in the analysis. At the same time, we do see similar reactions from feminism in Argentina during the second week of the quarantine in March and after a case of feminicide. They got organized and in a context of restrictions where the government had the restrictive laws, at the end of the day, they managed to keep essential services for women. So we have seen different examples in France, an increase of 32% of sexist violence in the first days of lockdown, and the government reacted, locating the victims in hotel rooms or facilitating infrastructure to host them. But let's think, this pandemic has forced us to stay at home, and it is in the private sphere where traditionally the violence has open its way. We have been disconnected from the outside world by isolating ourselves at home. And in this return home, what are now the messages? So the question for this theme is, how have we analyzed sexist violence through the pandemic, and what are the tools that we can use to analyze the situation, because it varied in different countries, and what measures are needed to fight this return home due to a sanitary necessity, but that we don't want to increase the risk of being victims of violence. So what are the answers to tackle this new situation? But before you answer, you can put your questions or your suggestions in the chat. We have many colleagues from around the world, and we can share with them all the situations in our territory. So, Clara, I give you the floor. Yes, thank you. As Nora said in the presentation, and at least this is the way I understand this in the Ministry for Equality in Spain, in the first state of alarm, the months of March, April, and June, May and June, the restrictions were very high and people were locked down in their homes, in their houses. From the ministry, we realized that this increased the risk to suffer from gender violence because they had to stay under the same roof with their attackers. So from the first moment, we had this into account and we wanted to send them a message across. We remain here, we are with you, we want to support you. On the 14th of March, the state of alarm was declared with domicile confinement. And a few days later, we created a contingency plan against gender violence that was highly valued by many governments in and outside of Europe. And that was the main idea. Gender violence is a pandemic within the pandemic. Therefore, it is an obligation by governments to put all resources at the disposal and service of victims to protect them in a context where the already existing vulnerability increases. And we did something very essential, which was to declare all services to assist victims of violence, to open a hotline where women could call and put all these services as essential services so that even in the state of alarm, those services could be functioning 24/7. Apart from this, we generated new services of assistance. For example, we established silent channels through which victims could contact psychologists and get psychological attention. We created a WhatsApp group. Well, if we imagine that if you are a victim of gender violence and you are living in the same house, you would like to have a special silent channel, be it WhatsApp, email, or a way to contact our services. We also sent a very clear message, a campaign by the government. If you are in danger, if you are living in a dangerous situation, you can leave your house. You can go to emergency services. You have resources at your disposal for being a gender violence victim, and you are allowed to leave the premises of your house. It was very important because we were launching a message as government about how important it was to stay locked up at home due to COVID-19. And apart from this, we established a system whereupon we offered another housing possibility to the victims. We increased the already existing number of housings. We offer the possibility to place them in hotels or touristic centers. So we complemented the services that victims have at their disposal to assist them. We created a new mobile application to geolocalize them if they were in danger. And apart from this contingency plan, in a second phase, we broaden this up to victims of sexual exploitation, because in the pandemic context, they have been highly affected by the situation. So these housing services were made available for victims of human trafficking and for women living or being victims of sexual exploitation. And we can control many of these things in a massive way. This hotline had more than 50% of calls, more than 25,000 requests for assistance during the months of a state of alarm from the 14th of March until the 29th of June. And these silent channels that I was explaining to you, the WhatsApp group and the email, increased more than 500%. So many women used those resources to ask for help, advice, support, etc. In Spain, we have also published a big survey on gender violence. This is a very important study that we carry out in Spain since 2004, the first time that we legislated in Spain on gender violence. And the data issued from this survey are overwhelming. Sexist violence is a structural problem. 1 in 2 women in Spain has suffered some type of sexist violence throughout her life. This is overwhelming, and this is a structural and hidden problem, because we have seen that many of these women do not make a complaint, do not communicate that they have been victims of sexist violence. And we are working in a new line in the Spanish government. In fact, the Spanish legislation until now, and thanks to this law in 2004 that protects the victims of gender violence, in their partnership, they protected women when they were being victims of gender violence by their current partners or former partners. And all these measures have to do with the Istanbul Convention ratified some years ago by Spain, that talks about the need to broaden up all available resources to all victims of gender violence and all its forms. So this is our priority working line. And sexual freedom is also a very important pillar in the Ministry for Equality in Spain at the current time. Thank you very much, Clara. Indeed, it is very important to understand all of these things. Otherwise, how can we tackle the different realities? We can't take them for granted. We can't speak in general terms. We need to be specific. And we need to put at their disposal all those tools that have to be very creative in many times. We need to be able to develop very useful tools and take into account the emotional aspect of this. And Hannah, I think you can give us another perspective. What I mentioned about the Argentinian colleagues before already happened in your organization. You have organized yourselves. During the pandemic, we are going to create a specific task force to establish from March a specific program to support your community of Polish women that come from a migrant background and that have a linguistic obstacle because they don't speak the languages spoken in Belgium, and they feel alone, isolated, and they need a lot of help from legal advisors, psychological help. So we would like to know the other side of the coin with the feminist fight in the core, to see how from the institutions, but also from self-organization, we have brought answers to this situation.
Clara, it's amazing what the Spanish government is doing, and I think you should be serve as an example of a great support for women, especially in those difficult times. So congratulations, because from our perspective, I'm not going to speak about Poland because it's of course awful, but even in Belgium, we feel that women did not and is still not receiving the support needed under this difficult situation. We know that there's an increase of around 30 to 40% of domestic violence, maybe even more. We know that COVID is and has been extremely difficult for women, especially vulnerable women. So my organization, Elles Sans Frontières, already in March established a sub-organization called Elle pour Elles, Elias para Elias. And the idea was very simple. There are around 30 to 40,000 Polish women living in Belgium. Most of them are coming from non-privileged backgrounds. They often do not speak neither French nor Dutch. They often are uneducated and conduct work in they are either cleaning ladies or hairdressers. So often they are in a quite privileged situation. So our idea was quite simple, to create a sort of an emergency hotline, which is now available every day from Monday till Friday for a couple of hours, where women can call us, not us, our specialists, so lawyers and psychologists. They can call them, ask for help anonymously. And those kind of calls are extremely helpful. We started, as I said, in March, April, together with Corona, and we already helped around 30 Polish women living in Belgium. And when I'm saying helping, there were also cases where there was a danger towards health or life of certain of those women, where we experienced that Belgian police and Belgian government didn't do anything. So there was a substantial risk that some of those women would just not survive. But it's not only about those hotlines. Those are the critical elements, but I think we decided to go much broader. We also provide workshops related to child support, custody, also for women that do not experience violence, but how to recognize that there is something going on around the corner, or something going on with your friend or with your neighbor. We also create some sort of circle of women, where women can just meet, unfortunately now online, but we hope soon also physically, where they can just speak freely about their experience and share their problems. Because I think this concept of female support is extremely underrated, and it should start from the very beginning, because it has a huge potential, huge power. So this is something that we also facilitate. And our next projects are also related to male sector, because as I said, Polish community in Belgium is really it's really simple, in the sense that most of men are a construction worker and most of women are cleaning ladies, to really simplify the discussion. So I think we also have to at least try to engage men in that discussion, and how they can become part of the solution. So this is something that we are planning in the future, and it's also something that Clara mentioned. I think there are two problems that we are facing, and I think this problem, those two elements are common everywhere, not only in Poland, Belgium, everywhere in the world. So there's a very strong concept of shame. Women feel ashamed, not only ashamed because they feel ashamed that they cannot do it themselves, that they do have a problem. that they do have to ask for help. This is something extremely difficult and extremely shameful, especially in Catholic tradition. The concept of shame and the concept of asking for help, it's very difficult, and I think this is something we have to try to prevent. And the second thing is the lack of trust, and the lack of trust towards institutions, towards police, towards governments, but even towards organizations like ours. People don't believe that their problems can be resolved, or that they will receive help that is continuous. Very often, even governmental help, it's ad hoc. Okay, we send police. Okay, 1 hour of psychological help, but this is not enough. You need to think about building trust that stays. So I think those two elements. I would like to also ask you how you feel about it, Clara.
Bueno, me parece estupendo que ya nos estéis haciendo preguntas.
I think it's great that you're asking questions to one another. That's fantastic. So we're self-organizing here in the workshop. Before you answer, Clara, just to go back to the very interesting questions that our colleagues were presenting. There was a question for you, Clara, from the first block, but it was a bit late. So in the conclusions, I can ask you that again. We have, first, they want to know what happens with communication. Clara, you're an expert in that. Many times, so the colleague is saying that many times we have services available, but it is difficult, especially in the context of the pandemic. And we've been reading, at least myself, I have had too much information. I was reading the newspaper, watching press conferences. And so she's asking, and also mentioning how often in Belgium and in Paris, there were graffitis, supporting graffitis. And this is the level at the level of other women in the neighborhood. This is, they do not know, the institutions do not know what's happening, but neighbors, other women do know. And we've seen graffitis written saying, this is a phone number, you might need it. So we see how we help one another communicate in these processes, but we have to go back to the issue of communication. That's the question. And Clara, the macro survey was very interesting. There are plenty of questions. And I think that this is something that concerns those of us who are struggling now and those who have been here in the past. What happens with young people? In Spain, we've had laws since 2004 and a strong feminist movement, but how do we see the future? How do we see young people? And finally, for you, Hannah, there are some questions about the Catholic Church and shame and how we have to struggle to have confidence in ourselves. So in the end, what they're sharing is that maybe from the experience of the Catholic Church, the idea is an idea of charity, of compassion. We have to help somebody. But from feminism, we're thinking about mutual support. And we see one another and we support one another. So this colleague was saying that maybe this is a paradigm shift for the future in order to work with the women who need support. So you can now answer in whichever order you prefer. Okay, shall I start? It's okay with you, Hannah? Okay, so there were several things. There's some ideas. First, we can go back to what Hannah said regarding silence. This is something that takes us back to the macro survey. The macro survey has not just hinted at the fact that this is structural violence, but about something else. Gender violence is not specific episodes. This is a long-term form of violence. Many times in the imaginary, we think that gender violence is something that happens on a specific point in time, or maybe we think about intimate partnerships or ex-partners, that's a bit different. But if we think about sexual violence, many times we think that this is something that happens once in a lifetime. But in the macro survey, we see that this is a continuum. It happens throughout the life of women. You you can face many different instances of violence throughout your life as a woman. And regarding shame, and one of the things that came out of the macro survey is that this is a silenced violence. We have other types of research telling us that it takes women a long time to express that they are victims of gender violence. We have another study in the ministry that says it takes around 8 years for a woman to say explicitly that they're victims of gender violence, to tell this to somebody else, especially in elderly women. But I think that the overload of what's happening should not fall on the shoulders of victims. So women should not become the victims twice. They should not feel responsible for sharing this. So the motto that we used, the slogan that we used when we were doing the macro study, the macro survey, was all victims, all violences, and all duties. So what we wanted to convey with the slogan was that we have to make all forms of violence visible. Gender violence does not happen in an intimate partnership. It's not just physical violence. There's many forms of psychological violence, stalking, economic violence, etc. So we have to think that this does not just happen in intimate partnerships or with ex-partners. It also happens outside of the space. Secondly, we have to give support to all victims. We cannot have second class, first class, and second class victims. We cannot have some victims having support and others not having it. So we have to include victims of trafficking, and we as public institution have the duty to comply with all the duties. So one of the conclusions of the macro survey is that we need to improve the public policies in terms of gender violence victim support, so that they do not feel alone, so that they tell it. This is a duty of public institutions. We have to have resources, we have to have services, etc. And I think that this is also important in order to avoid re-victimization of victims. If we go back to communication, there were some questions about this in the chat. This is also another interesting thing, because one of the things that we have diagnosed is that communicating to women in cities and in rural areas are two completely different things. So we have to articulate campaigns that reach all sorts of environments and all corners in the country. And this is something that Hannah also mentioned, and that has to do with the women's associations and women's movements, because we know that if we can establish a network in throughout the territories, are women's associations and feminist associations. So one of the things we did during COVID and also during the contingency plan I mentioned before was to produce and supply plenty of materials so that third parties, associations, businesses, groups of any kind, they could also launch this message to women. We prepared a poster for supermarkets that was very effective. It was just a sentence saying, here we fight against gender violence, so if you're a victim, you know that all services are available. And many supermarkets joined this campaign. We also had another poster for the municipalities, for the houses. This is very important, as Nora said. If you're in lockdown in your home and you're hearing that your neighbor is being battered, you can call the emergency services. You can do something. So that it was a way of conveying this message. The society as a whole can do something, even if our public authorities have their responsibility. And we've seen this in the macro survey, because indeed, when women express that they are victims of gender violence, they tend to do it with their close friends, family members. They go to the networks close to them. That's why the role of those networks is so important. Then minors, this is something that was also mentioned. There are several aspects. First, we have teenagers. There's a worrying message. We see that gender violence continues amongst teenagers, and we also see digital control, for example, controlling their mobile phones and through social networks, through social media. But there's another interesting reading, that is the protection of teenagers or minors who are direct victims of gender violence, be it as children of women who are victims of gender violence or as minors who are in themselves victims of gender violence. And in that sense, we have developed different lines. For example, we have the childhood law. We have different mechanisms, but this is another important aspect. And I'm sorry that I'm going on and on, but we also have a study of minors and gender violence. And we could see that if you are the child, if you're living in a family where there's gender violence, the possibility for boys of becoming a perpetrator is higher than if you compare it with a family where there's no gender violence. But the most important outcome of the study is that this is not deterministic. Not all the boys, not all the sons of in families where gender violence is happening are going to become perpetrators, or the girls are going to become victims. So we need to understand these messages, and we cannot just think that minors exercise violence, but that we also have many mechanisms to protect them and also to come out of this violent circle. Great. So Hannah, you have the floor again.
Yes, this is something that we are trying very much to do, Clara, to kind of try to get as many people and as many women as possible aware of our little project. We got quite a lot of support from regional so-called communes in Brussels, but this is something that we struggle a lot, how to expand our circle and how to make our project visible. Of course, it's quite unique in the sense that we only attract Polish women living in Belgium, but this is something that we constantly try to get better. And concerning the church, this is a very, very interesting dynamic that is happening currently in Poland. So you might not be aware, but Poland is currently country with the highest level of secularization. So you have a huge influx of especially young people, but mostly women that are now deciding to leave the church because mostly, not only, but because of the fact that church became extremely politicized. And also, as in every country in Europe, also and outside Europe, Polish church is really, we have scandal after scandal after scandal related to pedophilia. And this is becoming so huge that I think there's this moment that a lot of people are just turning their backs against the church. And it was actually quite interesting to see that in first few days of the protests, a lot of things were happening in front of many churches or even inside. There were groups of young people coming, trying to sabotage messes happening and trying to stop it with huge billboards stating that the church has blood on its hands. So I think you really see that it's not only against the government, but it's becoming more and more against patriarchal Christian Catholic domination that has been very prominent in last 30 years of Poland. So I think this is very interesting because the government is aware that of course it gets a lot of support from the church, and this old generation that goes to church also votes for law and justice, but they also see that they lose a lot because there's this unity of sacrum and profanum and government church. So I think it's really good because you can see that maybe two of them will collapse at the same time. I'm sorry for a bit of a propaganda from my side, but I feel that it's very important to signalize this unity.
Perfecto, pues mirad, vamos a hacer
Great. So if you think we can go to the last questions, there's also a proposal, and then we can move to the next block. So first, Hannah, in order to understand the dimension of your project, they're asking about the number of Polish women in Poland involved in the movement, to understand what you are doing. And they also ask both of you if this situation cannot be seen as an opportunity this explosion of inequality, so that people realize that the pandemic is making everything so visible that we need to demand that our rights are also written at European level. This has to be part of this European idea of progress, collective progress, because one of the things we've seen is that everybody's running for their lives at European level, and then everybody was introducing different measures and how infection was measured and the number of cases was measured. So can we not just block this at a European level and protect ourselves from the governments who want to deduct rights from us? Clara, if you may. Well, I think that speaking about the pandemic as an opportunity is it's a difficult matter, because in the European countries, this is a very difficult situation, but it is true that the pandemic has had an impact. We've discussed the issue of care very much in Spain. You know, that the feminist movement always spoke about the redistribution of wealth and redistribution of care work. This was also part of the feminist strike, and this is part of the policies that we're trying to introduce from the government. And as I said at the beginning, the pandemic has shed light on the fact that care work has to do with all the things that sustain life, caring for people who are sick, or being there as a cashier in the supermarket, or the pharmacist, or at hospital, or looking after children who cannot come out. So care work is huge, and it's precarious work, and it's the women's work mostly. So the idea of the pandemic is that it's made health care work visible. And if there's no care work, everything stops, because when everything stops, care work needs to continue functioning. And this crisis in care work has also shown how it is women who are overloaded with care work, overburdened. So I think that the pandemic has opened up a new horizon for the feminist movement to say that care has to be at the center of life, but it is difficult because this is a structural conflict for capitalism as a system, and that is precisely care and care work and reproductive work. In this sense, ourselves from the government are pushing for a new program called Co-Responsible Program, so that public policies can walk hand in hand with the families and work with them to care for children below 14 years of age. We've also had measures for 0 to 3-year-olds, and the maternity leave, parental leave. And this is something that the pandemic has highlighted. And I think that this is a problem that with the pandemic, as I was saying, at a European level, we've seen this, and we've seen, for example, gender violence as a priority. But at European level, the feminist strike, the latest feminist strike, already told us about this, because this question is going against the economic system. And this is basically an anti-capitalist struggle. And if feminist has become something in recent years, is precisely a political movement that goes against not just the patriarchal order, but also with against the whole economic system, which is just all for profit. So I think that the pandemic has given us the chance to look at this mirror. And I think that we cannot just move away and move towards the future without considering all these lessons that we were forced to take as a society. In that sense, there's much work to do. And I think that this is something positive as well, because we still need to continue forging our alliances in this regard.
Sure. So concerning this European level, as I said, I've been living and working in Brussels for the last 7 or 8 years. And I must say, there's a bit of a disappointment, and I think it still is after the COVID started, that there's limited actions from the European Commission vis-a-vis what can be done or has been done. So we of course know that the European Commission, the European Union in general, it doesn't have competences in many of those issues. For example, the European Commission cannot do anything about abortion, which is quite sad, considering that I think for all of us around the table, it's just human rights. So the fact that this topic has never been really addressed by the European Commission, and we have not received any support from the European Commission since the protests in Poland started in October. It's a bit sad. We, of course, as I said before, there's European Parliament, which is doing an amazing job, and there's a lot of initiatives related to reproductive rights, which of course we support. But there are a lot of things that can be done better, for example, related to social issues, minimal wage, all those things that I think are really basic when we are speaking about women's rights. And they are very much blocked by many countries. So I hope that and after and under the Corona crisis umbrella, there will be a stronger push that there is a need for more harmonization with that regard. The same happens with the Istanbul Convention. We are actually regressing. We are having more countries that are that either do not want to sign it or decided before to sign it and then withdraw their decision. Now I think there are 6 or 7 member states, which is huge. So it's not only Poland and Hungary, but we are seeing happening this happening in many countries. The same when it comes to abortion. We see many countries, instead of putting it still on the agenda, are deciding not to do this. For example, the Belgian government's coalition agreements, they decided not to put this point on the agenda. So I think there's a lack of harmonization, and there's even lack of basic discussion on those issues among European leaders, which is a bit sad. On the other hand, I think Corona brought something that I have never seen before, this unity among different feminist organizations around Europe. We got a lot of support from Belarus and vice versa. We got a lot of support from Ukraine, from Spain, Germany. So I think there is a sort of a broader feminist European movement that it's really positive. And I think Corona counterintuitively helped us with that. So I think it's everything. It's what is happening now. It's really bottom up, and there's little happening, unfortunately, top down.
Gracias, Hanna. Muy interesante, porque aparte.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That's very interesting. And apart from that, we also have interesting ideas for us to work together. There's something that they're telling us, and we seem to be speaking about the pandemic as if it was over. We're speaking about the lockdown as if it was over. And I think that these reflections are important. And we are here as if we were political analysts on TV, but we have to remember that we're still facing the second wave or third or whichever wave it is. But this is also leaving us in a situation of increased precariousness. And as a colleague from India was sharing, they've mentioned that they're very concerned about the loss of rights, especially because women are leaving the formal economy for the non-formal economy, and how in the end, this is also the setting in which violence exists. We also have colleagues writing about how it is possible, as Hannah was saying, that the right is so well organized and they have so much money, and we have to always focus on this context in which the pandemic is not in the past, and we're trying to generate unity because of what you were saying, Hannah. Well, we do not have competence over this, we have to create it. So the European Union has to be useful for us. It has to help peoples and help us attain our rights. We have to work together. In Madrid, we see how we're going to react next Wednesday. We see that we have many colleagues from Slovakia who are also facing the same situation with abortion. And in Hungary, the colleagues are saying this is the same thing that's going to happen to us. So regardless of what the European Commission does, we have to find ways of organizing ourselves, and some ideas are being shared in the chat. So let us move to the next block so that we can also speak to Rosanne. She's here with us and she has taken part in the chat, but we also want to hear her because in this, she's part of this process of sharing. We've spoken about different topics, and now we would like to think together about the access to a struggle to help feminism move forward in Europe. We know that we have the neighbors, internationalism, the institutions, rural movements. What are the axes of struggle so that we can cover the things that the European Union is leaving out? So with this idea in mind, also with this positive idea that you both shared of moving forward, because despite violence, women are unstoppable and we never stand still. So if we think about what the colleague was telling us, that the COVID is not in the past, we've learned stuff in the first phase. So what kind of tools can we design together? We will first also introduce Rosanne in the discussion because she can go back to an important topic that Clara mentioned, but she also embodies the personal is political, that slogan, because feminists are getting together to change your living conditions in real life through mutual support and also through collective spaces. So we want to ask her how we can move forward in our fight against human trafficking and in the situation of women in prostitution. You have the floor, Rosanne.
Oui. Vous m'entendez bien?
Yes,
Bonjour.
do you hear me? Good afternoon. Thank you for this amazing moment. I've highly appreciated the exchanges we've had so far. You know, I've been a prostitute for 22 years. I made the choice freely of becoming a prostitute at the very beginning, but then it became forced prostitution. As I said, I've been working as a prostitute for 22 years, and at some point I had to make a choice. The choice of being a sexual worker, but for me, I've never been a worker. It has never been a work. This is why I decided to become an abolitionist, and therefore I decided to rebel and to say we cannot let women work as prostitutes and being considered as meat by some men. This is something that shocked me. You know, I've been working now on the ground for 10 years. I've been listening to everyone, to prostitutes for 10 years, and often prostitutes have suffered sexual violence and other types of violence. This is something that shocked me. As a mother and a grandmother, this is what I do not want for my children and grandchildren. You know, I've been taking part in different seminars or meetings, and sometimes men considered it was something granted, that they had the right to go and see prostitutes. And when we were telling them that women were going into prostitution because they had no alternative, it was interesting because we had the chance to talk to those men, to hear them say this is the oldest job in the world, which is false. Listening them talk about equality while they considered that they were men, women, and prostitutes. was shocking. And you know, in France, there's hope for prostitutes because they get the chance to get out of prostitutions, and those who are supported by the authorities get out of prostitution and feel much better. And I'm happy to contribute to this. You know, I keep in touch with many former prostitutes, with many survivors that volunteer to help us. And you know, women, when they go into prostitution, they are young, they are children, between 12 and 18. I've met one recently. That girl told me, or that woman told me, I've been a prostitute for my whole life. When did you start prostitution? At 4. At 4, her parents were making her a prostitute. This is shocking. This is outrageous. So prostitution is not a choice. I've been starting a campaign to raise awareness about prostitution in 2014. Why? Well, because prostitution is not only about prostitutes. You have the clients, the prostitutes, but also those who manage prostitutes. So the pimps are those who benefit from prostitution, those and the money launderers. Today, I'm taking the floor because I work on prevention of prostitution. Prostitution is something very important. We need to tackle that issue. And for instance, sometimes I go put posters in shops, in pubs, in the street. And in such posters, it is necessary to put an emergency phone number, for instance, for prostitutions. Numbers they could call to get support. Same goes for children. We must put some emergency lines for prostitutes, including children prostitutes. Often in blocks of flats, there is prostitution as well. You know, mothers, they have to find a way to feed their children. And when I work with social workers, with educators, with judges, lawyers, educators, and so on, sometimes I realize they are not aware of how serious is this situation. Little girls now start prostituting from 12-year-old onwards. Why? Well, because they've been raped, because they were the victims of an incest. It doesn't really come to their mind at first to become a prostitute. There are causes, root causes that lead them into prostitution. And to tackle those issues, I think that everyone should know about the causes of prostitution and how serious prostitution is. When I started that walk, that demonstration, and that campaign, I told myself, I hope people will realize what is happening. The law was adopted. Now it is enforced. It is enforced as best as the different regions can. You have people that are still working as prostitutes. The lockdown made it very hard for those women. Authorities should have earmarked some money, should have created a fund, and some funds were raised, but not enough. Must keep working at the political level to make things better. It is necessary to ensure prevention and to raise awareness of women, even when they are very young. You know, clients, they think this is something granted to them. And this is shocking. It is true that from the beginning, they have access to the body of women in exchange of money. And this is something depressing. They think that prostitution is the oldest job in the world, but it's not. You know, all the women I meet on the ground, they all want to get out of prostitution. What was a springboard at first has become a habit. To get out of prostitution, you need to be supported by psychologists, by educators, by social workers, and so on. When I meet people, when I meet women, we need to exchange a lot. And it's only after 5 or 6 years that women realize that they have other choices. You know, it took me 10 years to get out of prostitution. This is not easy. It takes time. You know, in France, when women want to get out of prostitution, they have to follow a 2-year program. They go and learn French. They receive healthcare. You know, they've been through a lot. They crossed deserts, they crossed the Mediterranean Sea, often they've been raped. They arrive in a country where they think they'll be protected, but they're not. They are in the streets and no one does anything for them. They need us. They are willing to be supported. All the prostitutes that start this 2-year program get out of prostitution. All the clients that I see during meetings realize how serious prostitution is. They do not accept that this is a rape, and yet this is in a way, but they admit that there is no free prostitution, but only forced prostitution. So when we work with clients, they realize that. They realize that third parties forced prostitution. Sometimes you have indirect third persons that lead women into prostitution. It can be husbands, it can be children, even if it's not voluntary. Sometimes they don't have a choice. No prostitutes can keep doing this job without alcohol and drugs. And these are causes as well. You know, when I explain this, you know, I've been working with 300 students and they are all astonished when I say that, because in their mind, it's not possible. They were not aware of that. The victims of gender violence can get into prostitution as well, because they have no other choice. They think they have no other choice. So we need to make improvements everywhere.
Bueno, yo creo que es muy
Thank you
interesante.
so much. I think that this was very interesting. I think we still have some time, and as we have a couple of questions for Rosen, who has just started, maybe do you think that we can ask her the questions? And just to make sure that you can answer us, because many questions have written. First, they asked us, when you speak about the demonstration or that march, whether you can explain that, how that worked. And then if you have any information, or if in France you've measured to what extent there is prostitution and what's happened with the coronavirus. And then I think that we agree that we need policies, and that is to look at the most vulnerable women, those who are precarious and who lead them to environments of violence. And regardless of our position about it, we need to give them ways out of prostitution. This is also a duty. We need to have the policies that you were mentioning, prevention policies, to have a different type of society, but as you were saying, housing, work, etc. And they're also asking about the timings that you were mentioning, the periods and the process that you were discussing. This also has to do with silence in violence. Since the moment that you realize that something is happening until you make a decision, there's a long time going on. And whether these support mechanisms can help women make their decisions. Then there's another question regarding what you said, that we should not have this category of sub-women and the role that survivors have in this situation, that you can speak. We got a question about whether you're also part of the program to help women come out of prostitution, whether you're also agents of change with other women. So we were discussing the need to talk to somebody who understands you to come out of prostitution. I know it's many questions, but if you're not clear, I can repeat some of the questions. Thank you.
OK, alors tout à fait, j'en reposerai certainement. Alors cette marche, je l'ai commencée donc un 4 septembre.
Well, this is something I started on the 4th of September. I left from my last place of prostitution and I went from city to city. I tried to raise attention to the elected representatives. Now, most of the elected representatives didn't know how this works, so I started from the last place I worked as a prostitute to the first one. So I worked the other way around. It was a type of preparation for me, and I met many people, many elected representatives who fully agreed with me. It was always about the penalization of the client. So it took weeks to do that, you know. And many people have changed their minds. They have understood. So it was one thing to work with elected representatives. Now it's about trafficking in human beings. Nobody likes that. And prostitution is a different thing. For them, there is trafficking and other things. But no, it's not like that, because the other things lead to trafficking or are linked to trafficking in human beings. Because if you don't have clients, you don't have women who are being trafficked, you know. So it was daily work. We won a small victory at that time. So this march that I organized, well, I didn't meet many people at the very beginning, but the media took over and it became worldwide, you know, a worldwide event. So people became aware that there is no free and willing prostitution. Prostitution is always undergone. Trafficking in human beings exists and will exist as long as there are clients. So you need to attack the clients. If you cannot attack the pimps, you do it with the clients. And the clients are those who bear the biggest responsibility of what goes on today in the world. I'm sure of that. Never, ever shall we be able to abolish this last type of slavery when they are still clients. So we need to work on that and fight. We'll have to fight to make sure that we can move forward. Now, there's another question, of course. What was the other question again?
de la importancia de tener un plan para poder
It
salir
was
de
about the importance to have a plan to get out of the situation, to get out of the prostitution. So they were asking you about the process because you said it took a long time. And in France, the legislation changed to this end. And the final question, do you also belong to this, or are you also part of this process where you help those women that want to leave prostitution behind?
Well, I work with a lot of women who want to come out of it. Some do it in 6 months' time, others in 10 years. It's very complex. In France, this pathway has been designed for the victims of trafficking in human beings. And it is true that this pathway can take a lot of time. But once they have agreed on this pathway, they will get some money. I think it's around 340 euros. Plus, if they have children, they get training. Then they get help for their problems, because you cannot exit prostitution without help. Medical care, gynecology, psychological care. They learn the language if necessary. They have lessons to become aware of their situation. They get accommodation. All this takes 2 years. I say 2 years is too short, but it depends on the people, Some will get out of it fast and others won't. So for a sex worker, just any of these people who believe that this is a choice, well, then it takes much more time, because they are so used of speaking about their choice that it's hard for them to work. I met one recently who came out of it right recently, and because of COVID, she's facing difficulties now, and she would be tempted to go back there. But most of the time, these are words, because she's not back there. But she said, I'm sorry, I went back. But eventually she didn't go back. She sold her furniture to not go back to prostitution. She's able to resist, and I'm convinced of that. To exit prostitution, you need help. You need to change your state of mind. The same for those women who are the victims of domestic violence. For prostitution, it can take 1 year, 15 years, 20 years to exit it. It's very complex. We need to think about the care. So we're not crazy because we're a prostitute. No, we've been undergoing this. You need to unlock the situation. You need to try to understand and learn to rebuild yourself. It's not easy to rebuild oneself, of course. We need to know that people who've been prostitutes for years are tired. Their bodies are tired. They haven't been thinking for years. They need to take some hindsight. These, most of the time, are intelligent women with a lot of capacity, intellectual capacity, but they've just gone down the drain. So I'm very happy, because when I did this march, I felt isolated, alone, lost. And today, when I look around me, I see those women standing up, and I'm just amazed and so happy. I would like to make an announcement too. The movement of survivors in France will be created soon. We're waiting for the end of COVID, of course, to officially launch it. We'll have young women who've been the victims of prostitution at a very young age. They're very active on social media, and I'm very proud of that, because these are exceptional women.
Thank you very much. We wish you luck in that project. We have taken note of many of your proposals. and all the messages from your intervention. We need to remember that we need plans to leave situations of prostitution, and we can't set ourselves a specific deadline. We need to take into account the care perspective and all the problems around these women that are not mad just for having taken recourse to prostitution, and we need to understand the origins, the causes of this situation. And I've taken note of some topics such as migration, foreign laws, and how to guarantee a decent life for women, which also needs to take care of their needs so that they're not vulnerable and then starting this path towards the abyss. Thank you so much for your courage, your proposals, the long hours of availability, for having given us your testimony. Thank you so much. We will follow from close the situation in France, and we encourage you to stay with us. We are going to listen now to more proposals to advance in other fields in the frame of fighting against violence. And Hannah has now a couple of minutes to explain to us the needed advance in reproductive and sexual rights and the fight around sexist violence. What could be our common ideas to advance in those rights?
I'll try to be very quick. I think there are four things that, or three that are critical. Firstly, do not compromise, especially with politicians, because we've learned that whenever you compromise a little bit, you often lose the battle. So I think be firm and never compromise on principles. Secondly, I think it's maybe it sounds like a linguistic change, but I think it's a mindset change. I hate hearing all over again, women were raped, women were harassed. We have to stop that. We have to say it clearly. Men rape women, men harass women. As long as we don't change it, we will always victimize ourselves. We will always put ourselves as problems, and that should not be the case. So I think whenever we speak about those topics, we have to shift the linguistic, but also mindset towards who is the problem here and how to face it. And the third one, which I think it's really critical, is building coalitions. And building coalitions is something, not only building coalitions among women or feminists on European or global level, but building also unusual coalitions. As I said, in Poland, this coalition between feminists and LGBT is very strong, or feminists and climate defenders. This is another one. I think as long as we don't make it our joint cause, that it's not only about individuals, but it is a societal issue that has to be tackled, then I think our chances are much smaller. So I think those three elements: never compromise, build coalition, and semantic changes are, I think, are for me quite critical.
Bueno, Hannah, pues muchas gracias, porque aparte me estás haciendo mi labor, que es hacer resumen de vuestras intervenciones.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much, because you have made a splendid summary. You have taken good note of everything, and well, if we have some more time, we can deal with more questions. Clara, you have the floor. Yes, in the final reflection about what is European feminism, I wanted to highlight what Hannah just said. It is essential to tackle feminism from an international perspective, and this type of forum is essential to this end. And this must be a cross-cutting feminism that goes hand in hand with the LGBT platform, with trans community, with climate change, a cross-cutting feminism. Because at the end of the day, this is a fight against the patriarchal system, and it has different facets. This is an alliance between women trans people, LGBTI, etc. This is essential. The extreme right attacks the rights of women and also the rights of trans people, LGBTI communities. So this is a threat. The extreme right is a threat, and that's why we need to have an international alliance that includes all of those aspects. At the same time, we need to have a common agenda. Hannah said that the base of mobilizations for the right of abortion in Poland has had to do with many elements derived from the strike. So we need to have this common agenda in the movement, in the feminist movement, and continue our work from everywhere in the world. And I appreciate very much Rosan's and Hannah's intervention. What she told us about her experience, the situation in France, and how useful these exchanges are. And we would like to thank the organizers for having allowed this space for us. Very well. You have summarized everything really well. So now we can tackle some questions that appeared in the chat. We have 10 final minutes and everybody should leave with an answer. So Clara, they were asking two questions. One, could you elaborate a bit further on the topic? Because we all have this notion of common sense, but what do you mean when you say that feminist fight is the key to fight against far right? Do we take it for granted? But can we explain it further? And concerning the fight for abortion, Hannah told us about the fight in Poland. So could you make a connection with this fight in Spain? And from within your position in the ministry, do you know what proposals are there at hand? Because we would like to take example from other experiences. Of course, we are not living the same situation as in Poland, but there are some plans, and the law on sexual freedom is something that is resonating very much these days. So those two questions for Hannah, and a more collective question from the economic point of view. And in Europe, we know that we had a lot of lack of coordination, that we don't have enough competence. But despite all of this, COVID is very present. So what will happen to the funds from Europe? Are the funds specifically earmarked for different things? And someone else made a suggestion, which is to use the money at hand for European camps, children that travel around Europe, to generate spaces of prevention and emotional training. It is very important to use those international spaces to work on a European strategy. Since Clara has just taken the floor, we can give the floor to Rosen or Hannah.
I think most of the questions were to Clara, right? So maybe I will give the floor to her.
Sí, puedo contestar. Sí, comienzo yo, ¿vale?
Well, if you want, I start then. Feminism is the best antidote against the far right. There are two things that explain this. One of them is common sense. This is a fight that has managed to create an international agenda in the past few years. And no other political or social movement could articulate this with such an impact. Of course, there is a very important example in the climate change, but this is a better example of articulating a fight that connects abortion in Chile with abortion in Poland, a strike in Ireland, in Iceland, or abortion in Ireland. This is a very international fight, and from this perspective, it has been one of the biggest assets of the political left in the past few years in a global context. And most of far-right leaders are men, sexist, millionaire men, that place in the core of their speeches attacks against women. Is this really a coincidence? If there is a political order, a political proposal that is questioning the privileges of the wealthiest, from a gender perspective, well, this is the feminist movement. In Spain, Vox has gained a lot of votes in the Spanish reality, in the Spanish territorial reality with the Catalan situation, but Vox is able to go to Congress and negate gender violence. So it is no coincidence that the far right is making a battlefield of women's rights. Therefore, feminism is the best antidote. Concerning abortion, I think this was a question by Cristina. In 2019, there was a reform on the abortion law that changed the system that we had in Spain since the 80s. This reform was counter-reformed by the Socialist Party. In 2015, it was reformed. And this abortion law made it possible for women over 16 to have an abortion without parental consent. The objective of the ministry was to revert the PEP reform to make sure that women above 16 could have an abortion without parental consent. With 16, you can have a surgical operation, you can have a job, you can have sexual relationships, but you can't have right an abortion to have an abortion. So we wanted as well to modify the law, trying to update it to the current times. There are many types of violence. For example, violence against different types of or gender violence or reproductive or sexual violence, and we are working in this field at the moment. This is work in progress with other projects that we are working in from the government. Well, Hannah, I don't know, you would like to make a final intervention?
Sure, very briefly about the EU and how the EU can do and what can do. Now, some of you maybe follow that the European Union is currently discussing its budget for next 7 years. So there's this idea to link the European budget with rule of law and democracy. Of course, Poland and Hungary are trying to block it. So let's see how it materializes. But of course, for organizations like ours and civil society in general in Poland, this is critical. We want to see the European Union responding more heavily, even though it might, in the end, cost us, our society, a lot of funding. But there needs to be a strong push and link between the EU budget and rule of law. And one last comment from Clara mentioned that we should fight feminism with nationalism or extreme right. This is a very interesting topic. Just to give you a short summary, Polish girls were asked between 15 and 25, and Polish boys, so teenagers, they were asked, could you please identify which group do you feel closest with, or you identify yourself with? It was a bit of a tricky question, and the majority of Polish teenagers said Black protest, so feminist protest in favor of abortion law. And the majority of Polish male teenagers, they said they feel the closest with our Nazi or extreme right party. So you will see that we are now building a Polish society that is a young Polish society that is extremely divided. And you already see hordes of Polish women in their 30s and 40s that have no chances of finding a partner, because Polish women are becoming more open-minded, more tolerant, better educated, speaking more languages. And on the other side, you have men that are becoming more conservative, close-minded, homophobic, racist, and so on. So you have those two groups that have nothing to do with each other, and there's actually almost nothing that puts them together. So I think by building this strong division, we are actually shooting in our own foot, but because we will never merge those groups together. So we also have to be careful how to be a bit more positive in our rhetoric.
Sí, bueno, pues tenemos que ser positivas desde la realidad.
Yes, we have to be positive, but taking into consideration the reality that we have to fight the far right. We have to take a stand and go back to common sense, because being tolerant with the far right and homophobia is a bit complicated. We have to prevent hate, because as you both said at the beginning, the far right is not something isolated, but in the end, it is creating the hegemony that has money, that has the church, and the expression gender ideology, quote unquote, stems from the working roundtables of the UN on women's rights, and that was the resolution of the Catholic Church. So we have to stick together at European level. We only have 2 minutes left, so I will just remind you of a couple of things, because we're not alone. We're in a forum, and there are plenty of activities. So first, I'd like to just share with you that we have some friends and colleagues who are the presenters and the rapporteurs for this and the other workshop, because we have a women's assembly, we have the plenary session, we will be discussing all these proposals and all the advocacy work that we have to do at European level. So write this down, because this is on the 24th of November, just before the 25th, from 6:30 till 9 Brussels time. So we have the Women's Assembly with an international block. We will not reveal all the details now, but it will be great. And then we will also have a European block. We will be sharing the manifesto of the Women's Assembly and all the proposals, because we want this space to be the foundation for strategic work in the future. So we expect you there, and this has been a great webinar with lots of colleagues. And if you're not exhausted, today at 3 o'clock, you have a seminar on climate justice today against the system. So we know that we have to be feminist and anti-capitalist, and I'm sure you will be interested in this. And tomorrow we have a transform workshop at 10. This is the radical left in the pandemic world, perspectives from Europe. I'd like to thank the interpreters for the work. In the end, we cannot touch, but you make us feel close to one another. And thank you especially to the 3 colleagues who spoke, and we cannot touch, as Maria Eugenia Barros says, but the chat was filled with thanks, with enthusiasm, with hugs and kisses, support to the colleagues of Poland and interest in replicating the messages of Clara, and with love and solidarity towards the work of Rosa. So thank you all. And to conclude, I'd just like to remember Claudia Jones. She was the leader of the US Communist Party. And I think that she has to guide us, because before we started speaking about intersectionality and Angela Davis, we had this comrade who was speaking about the intersectionality of class, gender, and race, who says that who is at the center of exploitation must be at the center of the struggle. So I think with this idea of alliances and work for the future, we can say goodbye. Thank you, everyone, and see you very soon.
Gracias a todas.